differences between junior and senior quizzing. I would say the majority of the coaches, as you registered, I put in there a question, are you doing junior, senior, or both? And it seemed like the majority said that they were involved in both. A lot of coaches end up doing both. Even if you are not doing both, I think this will be beneficial to you. We're going to cover, Sister Elena is going to cover some of the things from a quizzer's perspective. We're going to cover some rulings, so we will cover specific rulings for each one. So I think this will be beneficial whether or not you're involved in both, and just seeing the reason, some of the whys behind the ways that they do questions, and some of those rulings that are kind of hard to understand. Hopefully we can clear some of that up for you, and I will do my best to end a little early so we can have time for questions. If you have questions over specific things, we definitely want to answer those for you. So you've heard plenty from me, so I told Sister Elena I will ask her to go first. She has been helping. If you don't know Sister Elena, she was a multiple-time national champion. She knows what she's doing. She works great with the kids, so we asked her to help us out a few years ago, Quizmaster, the beginner division, and she does an excellent job with our beginners. She does senior quiz mastering as well, so I'll ask her to come and talk about this.
Brother Stan. All right, so I'm just going to talk about some basic difference from a quizzer's perspective, juniors versus senior quizzing. What it really comes down to is junior quizzing is about, do you know the verses? You know the verses and where they're found. That's the basics for juniors. For seniors, we want to know, do you know the verses and do you know what they mean? So keeping both of those things in mind is really going to help when you're transitioning between both of those divisions. Junior quizzing, there are fewer verses, especially if you're a beginner. So if you're kind of really new to quizzing, the junior division encompasses beginners, which goes up to age 8, and juniors, which is up to age 12, 11 to 12, depending on when your birthday is. So for them, you're looking to see, do they know their verses? The questions are shorter, so there's 15 questions in a junior quiz versus 20 questions in a senior quiz. So juniors they have 10 points, they have 20, they have 30, so do seniors, but there's fewer of each of those point values. For senior, let's start with junior quizzing. As a quizzer, the time that they're going to spend per day isn't going to be as long as a senior quizzer would spend. And I would say for juniors, making sure that they are quoting through old verses, so review verses they've learned, and then their newer stuff each day. Repetition and consistency for juniors and seniors is so crucial. You have to make sure they are doing the things every single day. And however you as a coach or a parent need to figure that out, that's something important. For senior quizzers, it's pretty much they are responsible for doing their own quizzing. Some of them are going to need parent and coach help to quote in every day, and you're just going to have to decide who that's going to be as you get to know your quizzers. But for senior quizzers, they understand, we're responsible for knowing our own material. For senior quizzers, when it comes to charting for them, they're going to have to do more. So for juniors and beginners, I would say as soon as they know their things, one-time words are especially important, and two-time words for juniors. But when it gets to senior quizzing, they need to know one and two-time words. They need to know unique beginnings, unique endings, questions in the verse, exclamations in the verse, and verse statements. So if you, as a coach, have any questions on what those are, hang on to those, and we'll get to that at the end. So those are kind of basic differences between juniors and beginners from a quizzer's perspective. I know when I was a junior quizzer, I quoted into my parents every day. I was not responsible enough to do it on my own, so I had to quote it into them. They were very gracious about making sure that got done. If you have a junior beginner quizzer and their parent is little to no involvement, bring them into the practice, sit down with the quizzer and their parent, explain your expectations. That's something that's really important, is setting expectations for your quizzers. For senior quizzers, you're obviously, as a senior quizzer myself, I did a lot of quoting in by myself. I also had siblings who were in seniors at the same time. My sister was 2 years younger than me, So we would quote back and forth to each other. Sometimes I would call a friend and we'd quote to each other. So those are kind of different things you can do. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I'm gonna let Brother Austin take it over now.
Yeah, so Sister Elena mentioned for junior quizzing, we want our quizzers to know the verses. That's it's mostly about they need to know what the words in the verse are for the most part. For senior quizzing, they need to have a little more understanding if they're going to be successful as a quizzer. And so it's just kind of one of the philosophical differences. And then another difference is when it comes to the questions in junior quizzing, they focus. They give you a lot more leniency on the questions. So quizzers that are interrupting in junior quizzing, there's a lot more leniency. They give a wider range where they'll give it to you. In senior quizzing, they're very strict on the question. So because of that, in junior quizzing, they're actually sometimes more strict on the answer. They give more leeway on the question, but they're a little more strict on the answer. So every year, I have this happen every single year where I'll go to the judges and I'll tell them that answer that the quizzer gave, they would have been correct in senior quizzing, but in junior quizzing, I have to call them wrong. And every year I have coaches that are like, well, that's not right. We shouldn't call something wrong on a junior quizzer when we would give it to them in seniors. But the reason is because in seniors, they allow more leeway on the question. They allow you to do more things. They allow you to flip verbs and prepositions. And I'll come back to that in a second if you don't know what flipping means. But they allow more on the question, and so because of that, they don't just let the quizzer just quote the verse every time. In senior quizzing, they give you the benefit of the doubt that you understand sometimes. If you were able to figure out the question, that you understand when you quote the verse, you understand what the actual answer is. And so, well, let's just cover that flipping real quick, because that's a difference between junior and senior quizzing. If you don't know what that term is, flipping is when there is a part of the verse that should be in the question, but the quizzer puts it in the answer, or vice versa. So, for example, flipping a verb would be if the question says, Jesus overthrew what, and the quizzer says, Jesus did what, they flip the verb. That word, that overthrew, went from the question to the answer, where they interrupted it. In junior quizzing, that's okay. They can do that. We give them some leeway there. And even though the question is slightly different, we allow them to do that. Whereas in senior quizzing, you can't do that. You can't flip the verb. You will be called wrong. If the question said Jesus overthrew what, if you say Jesus did what, then you would be called wrong. The exception being, if you say Jesus did what, and the verse says Jesus overthrew the tables and said such and such, well, then your answer changes because Jesus did two things. And so Jesus did what, in that case, is not okay because it changes the total material that would have been needed in the answer. So in junior quizzing, you can flip a verb, you can flip a preposition. So if it's into what or where, those are usually the same question, or to what, whatever, unto what. Those are usually the same. Prepositions are, you can flip those. You can flip personal possessive pronouns. You can, like, his what versus just what. You can flip quantitative adjectives. So if there's a number, 5 loaves, if they put the 5 in the question or the 5 in the answer, that's okay to do. Most of those kind of things you can flip. Adjectives and adverbs, those are the tricky ones. Those are the ones that sometimes you can flip, sometimes you can't. This is for junior quizzing. I should make sure I mention that. So in junior quizzing, you can only flip an adjective or an adverb if it is an intrinsic quality of the verb or the noun that it's describing. So let's explain that. If the adjective is something like, so in the rule book, and just real quick, just so you know, there is a chart. So all of this stuff, there's a chart in the back of the rule book right here that tells you what you can flip or what you can't for junior quizzing. And again, most of the time in senior quizzing, most of these you can't flip. Just remember that. But so in junior, so if you flip one of the examples they give is vile raiment. So raiment, sometimes it's vile, sometimes it's not. In those cases, you cannot flip the word vile. You would be called wrong on those if they flip them. But if it's something like beloved brethren, in the Bible, when it talks about brethren, beloved is pretty much a part of it. When Paul is talking about his brethren, they're always beloved. And so in that case, we would allow you to flip it. Does that make sense? And just so you know, I mean, this is about the most complex we get. So I'm taking you trying to the extremes here. I want you to know the most complex rules. When I first started coaching junior quizzing, I felt like they were just randomly throwing questions in the verse, and I had no idea what the pattern was. And the more I've learned it, the more I see there is a definite pattern. And most quizzers, if you go to nationals and you watch the finals quizzes, what they do is they hear the verse reference, and then they only need one or two words, and they know what the question is. That's where they interrupt, because there is a definite pattern. They can start in the middle of a phrase in junior quizzing. In senior quizzing, they don't like to do that. They like the whole idea. In senior quizzing, so let's see. Let's go with Acts 4:12. Neither is there salvation in any other, for there is none other name. So in junior quizzing, they would just start with, according to Acts 4 verse 12, none other what? And the reason they start at that none other is because as soon as you hear the word none, you know right where to go in the verse. And you just start right there and start going until you find a question word, and then you throw a question word in there. In senior quizzing, they don't like to do that because that's not a full thought. When you just say none other name, that's not a thought. In senior quizzing, they want the whole idea. They want to make sure the quizzers understand the verse a little more. And they want the whole idea behind it. So they want to hear the quizzer say, there is none other what, or there is none other what under heaven, or something like that. They want the whole phrase. And so that's one of the differences. Seniors, they like the complete thought. In senior quizzing, they could ask things out of order. They could say, there is none other what, and then go back to neither is there what, something like that, where they go back to the beginning of the verse. Junior quizzing will never go out of order. In junior quizzing, as soon as they say none other, they will not go anywhere else in that before that part in the verse. And even if a quizzer interrupts and somehow they go back, they would actually be counted wrong because they're not allowed to go back. It's always straightforward. So that's another way where juniors, they can interrupt because they know it's not going back to the beginning of the verse. It's not allowed to go back. But in senior quizzing, it could. And in senior quizzing, at any point in time, they can ask according to which verse. Sometimes it's in the middle if it's a three-part question. Sometimes it's a first. Sometimes it's a second. Sometimes it's a third question. Could be any of those. In junior quizzing, they give you the verse reference, and then they begin their question if it's that kind of direct or two-part or three-part question. So junior questions, they're usually structured in a way that most quizzers, once they understand how it goes, they can interrupt right away. Senior quizzing, if you want to interrupt after the reference on a Brother Fulbear written 30-point question, you're done. It's not going to happen. And so when they were talking about, like Sister Ellis mentioned, question writers, that's especially important for senior quizzing. See, because they're going for the whole ideas, different question writers vary a lot. You can have completely, we went years where we went from Brother Knudsen to Sister Fulbear questions, and they were night and day different. It was like you were doing a completely different competition because the questions were so different that in junior quizzing, you probably won't get as much of that. Most of the questions are a lot more similar. So in senior quizzing especially, it's good to have good questions. It's good to find someone that's close. I mentioned Brother Fulbear because there is no one that writes questions just like him. Would you agree?
Right.
Vincent, there's no one that can write questions exactly like Brother Fulbear. He is a very intelligent person. He does a great job, but his questions, they get tough. He writes for, you don't have to worry about it during the year. You don't get his questions during the year. It's not until state finals, national. Actually, I don't even know if he writes state finals. Is it state finals too? Okay, state finals and nationals. That's when you're going to get his questions. But during the year, so questions, they do differ in style. But hopefully in junior quizzing, our questions that we use in the January tournament, you'll hear some of the same questions at state finals. Even though those are different question writers, they don't vary nearly as much. So, let's see. What else did I want to cover? Actually, I'll just pause for a second. What questions do you have? Why don't I pause in the middle? I do have a couple other things, but no questions. All right. Sorry, my iPad keeps turning off. I had some of my notes here. Let me see what else we have here. We might as well mention the pronoun rule, because that's a fun one. Pronoun rule is senior quizzing only. Junior quizzing, if you only do junior quizzing, you don't have to worry about this. Pronoun rule and senior quizzing, hopefully you know what a pronoun is, his, her, their, whatever. If you have a pronoun in a verse, and in that verse, that verse tells who the pronoun is, then you have to identify that at some point. So for right now, we're going to say if the question is according to such and such verse, and then it says Jesus did something, so and he also did this, and your answer is he also did this, then you would have to say he referring to Jesus, and let us know who the he is to make sure. Again, it's understanding the verse, and you would be surprised how many times quizzers are wrong on who the he is. And that's why we have that. We want them to make sure they understand when it says he also did this down here. We want to make sure they know that it was Jesus that did that. And so they're required to go back and identify who that pronoun is. If it's in the same verse. If it says according to that verse and it never mentions Jesus by name, it just says he, then they don't have to identify it. But if they don't give a verse reference in the question, and they do that in senior quizzing, then you would have to identify if it's anywhere in that whole chapter. This is not going to come up a lot this year because we're doing Proverbs. This year, you're going to be safe a lot more than in other years when you're doing Mark, or if you're doing Matthew or Luke, and there's stories, and there's a lot of keys in there. It comes up a whole lot more. In Proverbs, you're going to be safer, but every senior quizzer needs to know that pronoun rule. That is for intermediates or experienced. So let me just say that real quick. Intermediates and experienced, do not expect there to be any differences in the way that questions are ruled. Same with beginners and juniors. There is no difference. Some people just assume, well, juniors or beginners, they probably don't rule as harshly. Everything is ruled the same. The cutoff there is just because of the level of quizzers. My daughter started quizzing when she was 3 years old. There is a big difference between a 3-year-old and an 11-year-old. Right. To be honest, she's 7 now. Might be her 5th year. There's still a big difference between a 7-year-old and an 11-year-old. So they put in that beginner division to help some of those younger quizzers so that they can get used to it. They can quiz against people more at their level. And same with the intermediate division. That's for the younger quizzers. There's a big difference between a 12-year-old and an 18-year-old. 12-year-olds do not just walk into senior quizzing and quiz at the same level as an 18-year-old who's been working hard all these years. And for first-year quizzers as well. Of course, first-year quizzers can quiz intermediate, and that's because it takes some experience. But when it comes to ruling the questions, there is no difference between intermediate and experienced. There shouldn't be. There shouldn't be a difference between beginners and juniors. All the questions will be ruled the same way. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Is there a big difference in the question types from beginners to juniors?
No, there is no difference except for cross-references. That's the only difference in question types that you will see between beginners and juniors. Beginners are not allowed to have cross-reference questions with the exception of a cross-reference quotation. And a cross-reference quotation is always in beginners or juniors. It's always, quote, 2 consecutive verses, usually 2 short verses. They won't make them quote 2 long verses. That is really that's the one case where there is a difference between divisions. Intermediate and experienced, there's no difference at all in question types. you'll get the same mix of questions. So that's something as a coach you'll start to learn is there's rhyme or reason to the question types. There's typically, like in juniors, 5 of the 6 10-pointers are going to be a direct question. And then one of them will be a quotation or location question. Quotation and location, those are kind of get intermixed, but they usually only have a certain amount of like 2-part questions in the 20s. They don't do 3 or 4-part questions until the 30s. Just while I'm thinking of that, quoting a verse straight through. So I mentioned earlier that there are times when a senior quizzer would be correct, but a junior quizzer would be incorrect. A lot of times when that happens is when they just quote the verse. So real quick, let's explain. In junior quizzing, when there is a 2 or 3-part question, actually, or a direct question, whatever that first question word is, they're not allowed to say anything in the verse before that point that could answer that kind of question. All right, so according to Acts chapter 2, verse 38, be baptized in the name of who? If a quizzer says, then Peter said unto them, repent and be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus Christ, a junior quizzer is going to be wrong, because the first who that they said was Peter. All right, so that's how we get away from just letting them quote the verse. Otherwise, every quizzer could just hit the buzzer and quote the verse every time. So we have to have some way to get them to know, just answer the question. So as long as the first who they say is Jesus Christ, then they're okay. But if they quote the whole verse, they're going to be wrong. In senior quizzing, sometimes we'll call that correct, because we're going to say, I assume they know when we said in the name of who, they didn't think it was Peter when they quoted the verse, then Peter said it to them, repent, be baptized, every one of you. We're going to assume that they understood that. And so sometimes a senior quizzer would be correct in that case. A junior quizzer would not. So it only has to do with the first question word. So if it's a 3-part question, you might have had a who as the last one. That one doesn't matter. It's just the first question word. And it's whether or not something they said can answer that question. So sometimes they get lucky, and we might ask something out of the end of the verse, and they just quote the verse, but there's nothing that answered that question. So in that case, they would be correct, because sometimes they just get lucky and there's nothing else in the verse that answers that. All right?
Is that the same for the beginners?
Yep, beginners too. With one exception, well, not the beginners, but for beginners and juniors, a 3 or 4-part question is the exception. The rule book says then they can quote the whole verse. All right, I don't know who came up with the rule, but that's the rule. We will enforce it. A 3 or 4-part question, they can always quote the verse if they quote it perfectly. Now, if they misquote it, then we go back to the rule of, okay, what was the first who that they said, since the first question was a who? So they can, if they feel like they can quote it perfectly on a 3 or 4-part question, you can tell your quizzers, just go ahead and quote the whole verse if you feel comfortable that way. Does that make sense? So I'll say this, so these rules, first of all, if there are any of these rules that you don't like and you feel like it shouldn't be that way, that's okay. You don't have to agree with all the rules. I don't have to agree with all the rules, but I can't change them. So I will tell you that. I've been asked to change the age of quizzers. I've been asked to change different things. We will call things in Ohio the same way they're called on a national level. We want our rulings to match up perfectly with the way Brother Marshall will call them. He is our national junior quiz director, or the way Brother Folbear will in seniors. We want to call everything the exact way. I have been in that situation where things were being called differently, and we went to nationals, and our quizzers were just quoting the verse every time, and they were getting them all called right. And then we went to nationals, and they got them all called wrong, even though they had put in all the work. But they were being called differently, and our quizzers just had no idea why. They were being called wrong, and they had no idea. I want you guys to know all of those rules. If you ever have a question, if you don't know why did he call it that way? I'm sure that my quizzer did that correctly. Please come up and ask. We will allow you to ask. That's one place where I break a rule that's in the rule book. The rule book says you're not supposed to ask the quizmaster why you got something wrong. I will break that rule all year long until state finals, because I want you guys to understand. I hate calling quizzers wrong, especially if they knew the verse perfectly and they think they did everything right. I don't want them to go home and I don't know why I got it wrong, and that's all there is to it. I want to help you guys, so please come up and ask at an appropriate time in between quizzes or whatever. Come up and ask us, why did you call it that way? I will tell you, I have seen many times where coaches thought that a question was called wrong for a certain reason, and they were not correct. There was a whole different reason. I had a coach come up to me just a couple years ago and say, well, you call them wrong when they flip the verb, but in nationals, they don't call them wrong for that. And I was like, whoa, I would never call them wrong for flipping a verb. That's something I'm definitely familiar with. And they're like, well, you called my quizzer wrong on it. And I was like, well, I don't know what happened, but I would never do that. And so I found out what question they were talking about. Their quizzer had interrupted in the middle of a word and didn't finish the word. And it was an important word, but they didn't catch that. The only thing they caught was, the only thing that they missed was that there was a verb flip. And so they were assuming that I was calling them wrong for flipping a verb, when that had nothing to do with why I called them wrong. And it's one of those, if they had come up and asked, why did you call them wrong for flipping a verb, I would have told them immediately right then. But they were actually going to go home and tell their quizzers, well, in Ohio, we're not allowed to flip verbs anymore. And so that's the danger of just assuming sometimes. If you see something that you think is definitely different than the way they called it nationals, let us know. I can tell you, at least from the junior side, my wife and I, we're on the national staff. I work with Brother Marshall very closely. We go to nationals every year. I feel like I have a very good understanding of how he calls his questions. I feel like I've gotten to know him very well. And so I do my best. And if I don't know something, I'll send him a question. Just say, hey, how would you have called this? A coach came up and asked me and I wasn't sure. I have no problem asking him how he would call it. So feel free to come up and ask us if you guys ever have questions like that. We want to be open. We want to help you guys. I hate calling quizzers wrong anyway, but especially when they know the verse. All right, what questions do you guys have? Our time is almost up. Yeah.
Do they have to, in senior quizzing, do they have to reference it no matter what type of question? Like, say the reference at the end of their answer every time?
No, they do not. As long as what they have given is unique to that verse in question. So if they ask a question, let's say it has a unique word in it, then it's only going to be out of that verse, then they're usually okay. If they just say, Jesus said what, and over when we're learning Mark, there's going to be other verses that say Jesus said what. So if they don't give a reference, then they're opening themselves up to that opportunity. Well, another verse says the same thing. In that case, they have to be marked wrong. So it only works if that's the only verse that mentions what was said in the question there. At nationals, they usually they try not to give a verse reference if they don't have to. At nationals, you'll find that usually our state questions have more references, but at nationals, if it's a 10-point question and there's a unique word in there, he almost never puts a reference because he figures you're at that point where you know. Now, again, it opens you up to the pronoun rule too. So if the question had a verse reference and you don't give a verse reference, now you have to look for any pronouns that you mentioned in your answer and see if those need reference, right? Am I missing anything else with that?
The one last piece of the pronoun rule, if you modify it so that you do include the verse reference in the question, not originally include it, you still have to follow the pronoun rule. So you have to go track it down. So as a general rule of thumb, it can be helpful to go ahead and identify pronouns, even if you finish it out by including the verse reference, because he requires you to give all the information he wanted, even if your question modifies it slightly.
As long as you identify them correctly and you know your pronouns, it never hurts. You can always add additional correct information. So, so that with that pronoun rule, that's what has to do with that. Just so you know, in juniors, you can always quote the rest of the verse, because I know I mentioned if you say anything before that could answer that question, a quizzer can always finish a verse as long as it's not something. There are a few rare occasions, like if it says Jesus said what, and he has a quote in the verse and then he does other things, and so the question is Jesus said what, then you can't quote the whole rest of the verse because he didn't say all of that other stuff. that's rare, those kind of things that happen. But other than that, you can almost always just finish the verse out in junior quizzing.
So let's say, just to be clear, like if it's like, question number 1, like whenever they say, like if it's like the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, if they say the son of who, they just have to say David, and they can't say the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David.
Correct. Yeah, that's a good example. 1 verse 1. If they say the son of who, they cannot quote that verse in junior quizzing. In senior, I don't know, what do you think? In senior quizzing, I feel like they would most likely give it to them.
Yeah.
That's the thing. In senior quizzing, there's going to be more judgment. Junior quizzing, I always say, is a little more black and white. Once you learn it, it took me a few years to figure out in juniors how to find those black and white lines and how to find where those lines were. But once I found them, I feel pretty confident. I feel 98, 99% of the time my rulings are going to match up with Brother Marshall exactly, and because most of them are black and white. In senior quizzing, I never felt 98, 99%. Never. I quizmastered seniors for a number of years. I loved the thinking through things in senior quizzing, but there were so many times where the answer was, it depends on the quizmaster.
Right.
We would tell our kids that in practice, depends on the quizmaster. You're close. I know that's not a fun answer. That's not what, as a coach, you want to hear. What we told our quizzers, just give the right question and give the right answer. And don't leave it up to the quizmaster's judgment. If you give everything exactly the way they have it on the paper, you're going to get marked right every time. Just give the right answer and then don't leave it up to their judgment. You're going to have that. I do want to say the way that you react in those situations, because in those 50-50 calls, you're thinking one way, the other coach is thinking another way, someone's not going to be happy. Just be careful how you project that to your quizzers.
Yes.
Don't teach your quizzers,
Yes.
well, that quizmaster doesn't know what they're talking about, they're wrong.
That's right.
You just be careful about that, because I have seen quizzers that were perfectly fine with a ruling, but then their coach kept getting more and more upset, and then the quizzer started getting more and more upset. And before you know it, you have a coach that can't stand this quizmaster because of one ruling that was called wrong, and the quizzer doesn't trust them. They're like, well, they just called it wrong just because that's just what they do. Just be careful with that.
Right.
What else do you guys have? I know we are at the end of this session, but I don't want to miss any questions if you guys have any. You can feel free to email me, text me, whatever, at any point in time. At any time you have something where you're not sure, I have coaches that do that throughout the year. They'll say, hey, we had this come up in practice, how would you rule it? I've already had that this year where I've emailed and said, here's what I would say, and let them know my thoughts. I'm always happy to do that. I will never complain about talking about Bible quizzing.
I guess it's kind of like a subtle nuance, but like some of the questions, like specifically here, I was doing practice with my son, and it's like a 3-part cross-reference, and it's saying, verse 8 mentions the passive what, verse whatever it mentions passive what. What if there was like another verse within the same chapter that says passive what? Could it go either way, or is there? I know you might need more clarity on it, but if that makes sense.
So in junior quizzing,
For senior,
that's for
sorry.
senior quizzing? Okay. For cross-references, so I'll start with junior quizzing. Their cross-references are written on 2-time and 3-time words. So most of the time, there are times I've seen Brother Marshall write questions where he only picks out 2 when it was a 3-time word. He usually then goes to the meaning of them, because sometimes one of them just doesn't fit the pattern of the other ones. In senior quizzing, again, they're trying to follow patterns. They're trying to follow, if there are 3 verses in one chapter that specifically say the paths of what, I hope, or if there's more, I hope they wouldn't just leave one out randomly. There's usually a thought behind it. There's usually a reason behind it. I guess it would depend on the individual situation as to what that reason was. But it usually makes sense. They don't just randomly, I'm just going to pick these 2 for this one.
would there be a way, is there someone, like, if it could potentially be a typo or a glitch to go and get clarity and maybe get understanding, this is why they use this one, or, that might have been a typo kind of deal, just so I can teach them.
Yeah, I mean, depending on who the question writer is, and I will tell you a lot of times, especially if it's practice questions, I would guess in those cases where if you look at it and you cannot figure it out, most of the time it was probably a mistake. Question writers do make mistakes, especially practice question writers, because you're writing so many. And a lot of times they probably, I didn't even know that verse was there. That's why I didn't include it. I would say most of the time that's probably what your answer is, because it was just a practice question. They're writing so many and they just missed it. You can always reach out to a question writer and ask them.
Okay.
If you know who the question writer is, I would think most of our question writers are pretty open to that. As long as you're doing it in a respectful way, I think they'd be happy to help you out. All right.
Ready to swap?
Yes. All right, so we'll take a minute here, but, so the next session, in here, we're gonna have